So, my first kind of bullet point of what I want to talk to you about is they say most people are products of their early childhood experience. And looking at both personalities that are Carlo and Letizia, it seems Napoleon was a mix of both. He had the big dreams of Carlo and the practical, get it done, stick to itiveness of Letizia. Does that sound accurate to you?
Yeah, it does. I'd say the big dreams of Carlo really come in the DNA package that he gets from his dad, not so much from sort of Carlo's impact on him when he gets shipped off, and he really never sees his father again.
Right.
So he's he hasn't even really gone into teenage rebellion against his father when they ship him off to Brienne. Um, so the mother, on the other hand, I think is huge. I think Letizia's impact on him is huge. So Napoleon's got this idealized view of his father. He's a freedom fighter and everything, but he also has these ideas that the Bonaparte family is going to be a big deal in Corsica, and we'll talk about that because Carlo was on a fast track to be a big deal in Corsica until events overtook him. Um, but Letizia is fascinating. I mean, you mentioned it later. I mean, she has a zillion kids,
Yeah.
and eight of them, turn into adults. So they're quite a brood. I
Yeah.
mean, I'm surprised somebody hasn't done more on the Bonapartes as a clan because I think they've got everything on the Corleones and then some. And she is an amazing woman. Biographers look at this. Did so and so get mostly the dad, mostly the mom? Is he a mix of the two?
Right.
And Ron Chernow, in his biography of Alexander Hamilton, said it's clearly the mother where he gets his intelligence and his brilliance. And I think if we're going to give one of the two parents most of it, we're going to give it to Letizia. We're going to give Letizia 60 to 70% of Napoleon's character comes from this slip of a girl who's got a will of iron.
Right, and I totally agree with that. But I also don't want to minimize the impact on his upbringing on the tough mountainous terrain of Corsica and his siblings, who also had mixes of their parents. And I would say Lucien, Pauline, and Jerome were the dreamers, while Caroline, Louis, and Eliza and Joseph were the doers. Your thoughts on the siblings and how they affected Napoleon's early years?
Well, the one who has the most effect on him is Joseph. So Joseph is his older brother, and the relationship between Joseph and Napoleon, right until Napoleon comes into prominence, which really doesn't occur until after the whiff of grape shot. Joseph is a huge influence on his life. So I agree. Joseph is a doer. Although there's a little dreaminess to Joseph, there's a lazy side to Joseph.
Yeah.
There's the same is true of Elisa. Elisa, who's his sister, is quite a strong, independent kind of a personality. And of course, Lewis and Carolyn are too.
Mhm.
So these are the very, practical minded. I would say Lucian is an interesting combination of both dreamer and practical, but he's so independent. I mean, Lucian is that guy who, I mean, I'm still amazed Lucian, when he comes to America, he just doesn't become president, because he's so much of what we would think of as sort of the American approach to democracy and
Mhm.
republicanism. But he's independent. He forges his own path. Pauline and Jerome, they're just spoiled brats. Let's just
Yeah.
face it. And maybe we'll talk about. There's one person that's not on your list, and that's Luciano. This is Carlo's uncle,
Uncle,
who
yeah.
is a huge impact
Yeah.
on Carlo, but he also has a big impact on Napoleon. And so Luciano is a huge impact too. We
Mhm.
we kind of forget about him in many ways after Carlo dies. Luciano, archdeacon of Corsica, is a huge impact, and we always forget about him. There's some other impacts too we're going to talk about, but I'd throw him on there. But as far as siblings go, yeah, I think your take is pretty correct.
Okay. Well, let's discuss the parents. Carlo Bonaparte was born in March 1746. Much has been made of Napoleon's, quote, minor aristocracy, end quote, upbringing. What was Carlo's family and upbringing like?
So the Bonapartes of Corsica, and I'm going to show a book here, Steve England's Napoleon: A Political Life. He really goes into the Bonapartes of Ajaccio.
Hmm.
They are an established major family in that part of Corsica. In fact, they're one of the major families of Corsica. There are these clans. There's the Paolis, there's the Salicettis, there's the Bonapartes, there's the Buttafuocos. And so they are an established clan. We'll get into why that is here in a second. But his upbringing is already, before they become French minor aristocracy, they are already considered minor aristocracy by the standards of Corsica.
Yeah, and I think though some people get confused, like they weren't rich. I mean, they had a nice house, but I wouldn't call the Bonapartes rich growing up.
So, compared to most Corsicans, they're rich,
Mm-hmm.
okay? Are they among the wealthiest of the Corsicans? No. But they are definitely in the top 10% because they're a family of lawyers. They come from money, they have a way to generate money, but they also have land, and the family is an extended family. So
Mm-hmm.
the extended family has money. Luciano, who is Carlo's father's brother, has money. He's a churchman. He's got money.
Mm-hmm.
So there is money there that doesn't come directly from Carlo or Carlo's father, who is also a lawyer. But essentially, the Bonapartes are lawyers, and they live in Ajaccio.
So Carlo initially follows his father's footsteps and studies to be a lawyer. But what is going on in Corsica politically at this time? Because I know the island had long been a possession of Genoa.
Yeah, so this is a period of, for the Corsicans, of benign neglect. Yes, they become a Genoese possession, but the Genoese never really implement ironclad control over Corsica. All they wanted was the ports,
Mm-hmm.
particularly the ones in the north, Bastia and Calvi. So, but they're not interested in the interior. And so they have this very relaxed rule of Corsica, where there's only a couple major towns where they keep garrisons. So the Seven Years' War is the tipping point. When the Seven Years' War occurs, part of the settlement at the Treaty of Paris is to give Genoa as sort of a compensation to the French. You know, France loses the Seven Years' War, but she gets Corsica as sort of a sop for the other things that she's lost, particularly the New World. Her empire in North America is lost, but she gets this possession in the Mediterranean. And so Genoa basically goes, yeah, we don't really control the place anyway. Yeah, so you can have it. Fine, Louis the 15th and Duc de Choiseul, it's yours. Good luck bringing it under control. And
Right.
so that's what's going on at the time that Carlo is a young man, and he's studying in Italy to be a lawyer. We think he's going to school at the university in Pisa,
Yeah.
but he gets called back to Corsica because of this impending crisis with the French asserting control over Corsica.
Okay. Well, let's discuss Napoleon's mother now. Maria Letizia Bonaparte was born in August 1750. She's the daughter of an army officer, and her family was recognized as part of the Italian nobility. What was her early life like?
So her early life is just like Napoleon's. I mean, she's a child for this period that we're talking about. Her family are the Ramolinos. And this is where we can talk about all these families. One of the reasons the Bonapartes and the Ramolinos, the Buttafuocos, all of them are important is they all come to Corsica in the 17th and the 18th century. And all of them are sort of these Italian mercenaries, Swiss mercenaries, who set up residence in Corsica, and they basically become the leadership of Corsica. So they're all from the Italian nobility, but they initially weren't. They were mercenaries, and they're basically kind of given a place to go in reward for their services. So the Ramolinos come from mercenaries, and the Bonapartes come from Tuscan mercenaries, but actually they were from further north in Italy, Lombardy, and then they moved south. So she's a daughter of a Ramolino. Ramolino dies and leaves her mother, Minama, widowed. Minama is still very young and beautiful herself. I mean, you know, she's very young when she gives birth to Letizia, who's her oldest daughter. And so she remarries, and she remarries a Swiss mercenary, a guy named Joseph Fesch, who will have a son with Minama, who will be Letizia's stepbrother, Joseph Fesch, who will later become importantly Cardinal Fesch. So
Yep.
that's her background, but she's very young, very Catholic, going to a Catholic school, being essentially educated by nuns, but she's very, very intelligent. She's literate. So both of these families come from the class that is literate, and that's how you know they're important. They're literate.
Right.
Okay.
Right.
Now they're literate in Italian Latin, and maybe French. The first two languages of Corsica are really Italian and Latin. All
Hmm.
right. So it depends on whether you're in the church or not, whether you know Latin. But so she's very young. She's 14 years old, and you're going to get into that.
Yeah, in June 1764, there was a marriage between 14-year-old Letizia and 18-year-old Carlo. How would you describe their marriage? Was it a happy one? Because it sounds arranged, sort of. I don't know if they
It
actually
is.
fell in
It's
love.
absolutely an arranged marriage. By this point, the paterfamilias of the Bonaparte family is no longer Carlo's father, who's died, right, of stomach cancer. All right. But it's Luciano, his brother. Luciano says, "All right, he tells Carlo's mother, Severia, you need to get married. You need to come back from Pisa and take control of the family because things are going to change and we need you back here. We need all the talent we can get." So
Mhm.
they set up this marriage with the Ramolino clan. So Carlo and Letizia are promised to each other without ever seeing each other, sort of standard procedure here.
Mhm.
And he doesn't want to get married. He's having a good old time in a college town, being a college playboy,
Right.
and so he's so upset about the marriage he refuses to get married in the church. So so they are married in a civil marriage.
Right.
Because Corsica is self-ruled by the Paolis,
Mhm.
and so they're getting a civil marriage. Very few nations in Europe do this. I mean, Corsica's almost like the United States. It's this oddball republic that the Genoese are allowed to exist. So, but Carlo expresses his distaste for the marriage by saying, "I refuse to get married in the church. I'm a man of the Enlightenment. I'm a man
Yeah.
of reason. I don't believe in religious nonsense. And if you're going to make me get married," so they get a civil marriage. And Letizia is horrified. She's a good little Catholic girl. I mean, she's
Right.
14 years old, for God's sake.
Right.
I
Yeah.
mean, you can't make this stuff up. So
Yeah.
it's not a happy marriage. But they do get pregnant right away. And Carlo goes on to become Paoli's secretary.
Yeah, and I want to get into that. There's a couple things in this question. The couple go on to have 13 children, of whom 8 survive. Napoleon is the second born child, as you mentioned, after Joseph. And around the time of Joseph's birth, Genoa formally cedes Corsica to France. The freedom fighter Pasquale Paoli leads an armed resistance against the French, and Carlo serves as secretary to Paoli. This is an important position, correct? So I remember Alexander Hamilton is a secretary to George Washington. It's not like how we think of secretaries now.
Yeah, the analogy is extremely well made. So Paola, they're married. Um, Letizia gets pregnant. Paoli sends Carlo off back to Italy where he has an affair and wastes money. But his whole idea is to get loans for Corsica from the Florentine bankers, which he does. He does that correctly, but he has an affair, a very public one. It
Mm.
gets back, and then on top of it, Letizia has a miscarriage. So her first pregnancy is a miscarriage. And Carlo comes back, and he everybody sort of says, you're an idiot. But they give him a second chance, and he gets Letizia pregnant, and now she does have a baby, but it's right in the middle of this war for independence.
Right.
And he gives a famous speech in Corte. Some people say the speech was really given by Paoli, but when you read the speech, it's this rousing, call to liberty and defend the freedom of Corsica against the French invaders. So he's one of Paoli's right-hand men in the revolution, in the War of Independence
Mhm.
that takes place against the French. And, it goes poorly, but initially it doesn't. Initially, the French have some setbacks,
Yeah.
and they have to send down the first string. Initially, they send down the second string
Yeah.
with what they call the Corsican Legion. Carlo becomes a soldier, a captain in Paoli's army, and is with Paoli at the Battle of Novo Ponto.
Yeah. And I know Paoli is one of Napoleon's biggest, I guess, role models, but we'll come back to that. Paoli and his supporters are eventually defeated by the French, and Carlo decides to ingratiate himself with the French conquerors of Corsica. How does he do that?
Okay, so there's a couple things going on here. So the war goes poorly. They send a new French general down, a guy named the Marquis de Vaux. He's got orders from the Duc de Choiseul to kind of to make Corsica come to heel. He sends this guy, the Comte de Morboeuf, down as his political advisor. So after this big defeat outside Corte at the Battle of Newbridge or Ponte Novo, everybody heads to the hills. The Salicettis flee, and Carlo flees back to Ajaccio, and he's hiding in the hills of Ajaccio with his young son, his teenage wife, who's pregnant with another baby, who is you know who,
Right.
right?
Right.
Napoleon.
Right.
And Marboeuf offers the the franchise of French nobility to all of the people. So Luciano, Napoleon's uncle, says, "Hey, you really need to accept the franchise." And so Carlo comes out of the hills, meets with Marboeuf, and he accepts the franchise.
Yeah.
So it's not that he's ingratiating himself; he's only doing what's practical. And so this is the practical side of the Bonapartes
Well, that's
that's
what I
coming
think.
through.
That's what I think would happen. Either Letizia had to talk with him and said, "Look, we're not running around the hills anymore. I'm pregnant. You need to get in good with these new French conquerors and maybe get into the aristocracy there, and our lives will be more settled."
Yeah, so just about every family in Corsica accepts the amnesty, and as a reward, Marboeuf gives them all titles of nobility. Now, the first clan gets the biggest title of nobility. That'll be the Botafucos. They basically become barons. But Carlo comes in and he's made a chevalier, a minor nobility. I think Fesch is also awarded a chevalier. So the
Okay.
Ramolinos also come into the clan. Luciano, because he's a churchman, gets to retain his rights and responsibilities in the church, except now, he's working for the French branch of the Catholic Church, not the Corsican branch.
Right. In April 1770, the French create the Corsican Order of Nobility, and Carlo is included. And although Carlo has many titles, he isn't satisfied and embarks on what I would call get rich quick schemes. How do these turn out? Because I know he's also gambling a great deal at this time. After one trip to Paris, Carlo noted, quote, "In Paris, I received 4,000 francs from the king and a fee of 1,000 crowns from the government, but I came back without a penny," end quote.
Yeah, unfortunately for Carlo, he's probably a pretty good lawyer, or at least a good enough lawyer. He does get an income. He's granted a bequest, the 4,000 francs from the king. But the biggest advantage of being a noble is that his children qualify for all of the benefits that come with being part of the French nobility. Now they're minor nobility. So there's only kind of two places they can go. They can go into the army or they can go into the church.
Mm-hmm.
But that means free education, which is absolutely huge. And the first one to benefit from this of Carlo's children will be Joseph. He'll get to go and study at Aix-en-Provence. He goes to Aix-en-Provence and studies there, initially in the church, and then he'll switch to being a lawyer, decides the church isn't for him. They get this, but yeah, Carlo is a spendthrift. He doesn't know to handle money. Now, Carlo isn't the only source of income. All right. Remember, Fish has got an income. The Ramolinos have an income. Luciano has an income. But yeah, Carlo is not very good with money. And he kind of spends it as quickly as he gets it. And he's that guy who just can't seem to hang on to a dollar bill or a franc in this case.
Well, Carlo's able to get his two oldest boys, as we mentioned, into state run schools on paid scholarships. And I think at the age of 9, Napoleon is dropped off at military school in France by his father. I mean, this must have been really hard for young Napoleon. Very Spartan accommodations, not knowing anyone, not being able to speak French fluently. But at the same time, I'm often amazed that a dad in Corsica deciding to take his 9-year-old to a military college would affect the whole world. It's such a butterfly effect decision that seems minor at the time, but I mean, it turned into an emperor.
It's almost overdetermined. Historians have different words they use, and one of them is overdetermined. The first son goes into the church, or inherits, everything.
Yeah.
And Joseph decides he wants to be the paterfamilias, so he drops out of the church and goes to become a lawyer to basically follow his father's footsteps. And the second son goes into the army. The same thing happens to Wellington.
Mm-hmm.
Wellington's born the same year, and he's not going to be the guy to become Lord Mornington. He's gonna be the guy that goes into the army, right?
Yeah.
And he's dropped off too, at a public school. just like Clausewitz is dropped off at the regiment, when he's 11. So, all of these famous men that we're talking about in this period, John, they all have the same pattern. They're
Yeah.
all dropped off at a private school somewhere, usually a military school. And so Napoleon is just this Italian misfit who gets dropped off. I mean, he's an adolescent, so he's got his hormones kicking in. He doesn't know the French language. He's got this idealized vision of Paoli as the father of his country.
Right.
And so, even though his father has abandoned the Paolist, dream of an independent Corsican republic, Napoleon never lets go of that dream. And then he gets dropped off with a bunch of snooty strangers at Brienne in the far north. I mean, he's coming from the land of warmth and Italy, and now he's going to this cold, inhospitable northern wasteland as far as he's concerned. So he's a real duck out of water up there in Brienne. But this will sort of lead to, everything that happens.
I would say it shapes his character a little bit, though, that he had to survive in that austere
Yeah.
environment. You know.
No, and so he becomes very, very self-reliant. And this is Letizia, right? So Letizia, same way. She's abandoned by her husband. She's pregnant. Her husband's off in Corte. She's in Ajaccio. And so she's very self-reliant. And so Napoleon kind of follows in her mold of being very self-reliant. And he's insular. He's introverted. He's an
Yeah.
extreme introvert. There's a Billy Joel song. I wrote this down when I was looking at your questions. It's called The Angry Young Man. And that's Napoleon. He's
Yeah.
the angry young man, He's passionate, he's introverted, but he's boring as hell, right? At least around women he is. And so that's Napoleon. He's this
Yeah.
introverted, intense, guy,
Mhm.
that people, are like, they don't want to be around him.
Right.
Anyway, we go back to Carlo.
Well, in 1782, Carlo grows weaker and suffers constant pain. He seeks medical attention for years, but dies in February 1785. It is believed to be stomach cancer, the same disease that also kills Napoleon and Caroline later on. How are the finances of the family when he dies?
Okay, a word on the cancer. It's congenital, and it's what we call a gastric sarcoma. And I'm a big believer that for the Bonapartes, this is something that occurs to them in a relatively young age. They'll get this type of sarcoma. There's two types of stomach sarcomas. There's one that you can get when you're old, and then there's one that you can get when you're young. If you get the young one, the only solution is surgery. Well,
Hmm.
medical science hasn't reached a point where you can go in and cut one of these things out of a stomach. The surgery will probably kill you. Now, you might go, why would you know so much about gastric sarcoma? My own son had it.
Oh,
He
wow.
developed it in his early 30s, and he had to have surgery to get it
Hmm.
removed.
Yeah.
So I always tell my son, I said, you had the same thing that killed Napoleon, but you survived it. So, look what you're going to be able to do, right?
Right, right.
So let's go back to the question, so the finances. I was thinking about the question, how desperate it is when Carlo dies,
Mhm.
but it's not that desperate. He's got two people that could be sucking the money down who are on the benefices of the French state, Joseph in Aix-en-Provence and Napoleon in Brienne. And then later Napoleon goes to the artillery school and then he goes to the École Militaire. So you don't have to pay for them. And now who inherits the family's finances? Well, good old self-reliant, frugal Letizia. And
Mhm.
she's not all by herself. She's not a widow with no means.
Mhm.
She's got the Ramolinos who can still support her because she's a Ramolino, right? So she's friends with the fascists and Luciano. Luciano has money. And so, yeah, she's got all these kids. Bonaparte leaves her with 7 more children. So, yeah, she's got this brood of kids that she's got to worry about. And what's the biggest reason that the Bonapartes are having money problems? Carlo.
Carlo.
Well, he's dead. So the guy who's the biggest problem for the Bonaparte finances is gone. So, part of what I'm going to try to get across to your listeners here is, yeah, the financial circumstances are tight, bordering on desperate because of all these young children. However, she's got a pretty good safety net there in Corsica. And it's only going to be when Joseph and Napoleon come back and try to sort of create this league with Paoli, and then have the break with Paoli and the whole French Revolution and the British come to Corsica, that things are really going to get tight. So it's not until that happens that things get really tight, when the Bonapartes sort of have to flee Corsica for southern France.
Right. And I think that's where Letizia learns her legendary frugality is during this time.
Yeah, it's when she gets to France that she really has to be tight fisted. But now she's got two more benefactors, and she lets them know. She lets Giuseppe and Napoleon know, you two have got to provide the money for the family. We don't have our family safety net in Ajaccio anymore to help us. We're
Yeah.
now, we really are totally on our own wits to make our money,
Yep.
because we don't have the family lands and we don't have the family house and everything in Ajaccio.
Well, in 1786, Napoleon returns home after 8 years away. He's now serving as a lieutenant in the French artillery, so he has a little bit of money. But things get worse. In 1793, Napoleon and his brothers break relations from Paoli, and Paoli's supporters ransack and burn the Bonaparte family home, and Napoleon, his mother, and the siblings get away with just the clothes on their backs. Letizia, now destitute, arrives in France and relies on soup kitchens and Napoleon's salary to get by. I mean, this is probably the lowest point for the whole family, I would think.
Yeah, and this is the impact of the French Revolution. Okay, the whole idea of liberty, equality, and fraternity, it just doesn't work out. All right. And Napoleon and his brothers' efforts to sort of lead the charge for Corsican independence, runs afoul of Paoli, when Paoli kind of, it makes common cause with the British, who are the biggest enemies of the French Revolution. And so now they're Republicans. They're not nobility. They can't, oh, we're nobility. We deserve all of the largest of the state. No, well, now it's the Republic. And it's, career of talents, right?
Right.
Well, the only careers going on here are Napoleon's and Joseph's. And so Napoleon and Joseph and Letizia now have to come up with the means. And so when they're living in Marseille, the circumstances are very, very tight. They become, all of a sudden, at a stroke, they become part of the lower middle class.
Mm-hmm.
And they're citizens, and this idea that they deserve anything because of their bloodline is complete nonsense. And they become Jacobins. They go, yep, we're Jacobins,
Right.
the working man, intelligentsia elite, or the Republican intelligentsia. And so who do they make common cause with? Well, they make common cause with the Robespierres,
Yep. Yep. Yep.
and so Letizia sees her sons become these radical Republicans, and
Yeah.
all of the children follow suit,
Yeah.
except the youngest, who's
Yeah.
still, they're still in the nursery, being taken care of by Letizia and their faithful nurse
Camilla.
Camilla.
Yeah.
So she flees there. So, so Letizia is like, hey, I need some money, guys. You need some promotions, right? And Joseph's law practice isn't bringing in a lot of money. And all of a sudden, Napoleon becomes the man. You gotta get promoted. And so Napoleon goes, okay, I'll line up with the Robespierres, if that's the way that I can get patronage so that I can advance in the ranks.
Well, it's interesting to me. And the older ones knew how dire it was. Like Napoleon, Joseph wasn't that frugal, Lucien. But the younger ones seem to be the most spoiled, maybe just because they never experienced that hard time, like Jerome, Caroline, to Pauline. They were more spoiled, the younger ones, than the older ones.
Yeah, they are. In this period between 1793 and 1795 is the period where Letizia is probably the most desperate in terms of money.
Hmm.
But she's confident that Napoleon and Joseph can deliver.
Yeah.
And of course, the one who's going to deliver is going to be Napoleon, the one who's most like her.
He's a hard worker. Yeah, she
Yeah,
knows. Yeah.
yeah.
Well, circumstances improve when Napoleon becomes famous after the victorious siege of Toulon and suppressing the Paris revolt in 1795. Napoleon gets promoted, has a more sizable income to take care of his family. However, a new problem arises in the form of Josephine. Why did Letizia and the rest of the family disapprove of Josephine?
Yeah, it's just when the family's got everything together and Napoleon becomes a general as a reward, for his loyalty to the very corrupt government that also is rapacious and rewards, people who support it with lots of money. So Napoleon hits the jackpot with the whiff of grape shot. He falls in love with Barras' mistress, which is intentional. Barras wants to get rid of his mistress because she spends money like it's going out of style. So he fobs her off on Napoleon, and that's why nobody supports this marriage. Josephine is notorious in her ability to spend money and create debt. So that's why the family doesn't approve. They want Napoleon to marry a more sensible girl like Letizia.
Yeah, and you jump forward a few years when Napoleon wants his brothers and sisters to marry nobility, but they make the very good point, like, you didn't marry nobility, you married some lady who's older than you who had two kids, a divorcee. So I could see the friction between the family, like, well, you're telling us one thing, but then you went and married Josephine.
Yeah, and that's kind of the answer to your next question,
Yeah,
which is, that's why Letizia doesn't come to the coronation. She detests Josephine. They almost get Josephine. Anyway, Napoleon comes home and she's having an affair with that Hippolyte guy,
yeah,
and and Napoleon is furious, and Eugene and Hortense have to beg Napoleon to forgive their mother, and Letizia and Joseph and the whole clan are like, great, he's going to divorce her, right? Because this is the
yeah,
Republic,
yeah,
you can get rid of her, right?
yeah.
And they come over to the house, and Napoleon's back in bed with Josephine, and they're like, rats,
Rats.
so
Yeah.
they detest Josephine. None of them like her. All right, not a one of them likes her.
It's fascinating though that in the famous artwork by Jacques Louis David, he paints Letizia in there, even though she wasn't there.
Yeah. And Napoleon knows that. I mean, he could have given his mother a big grand title. She didn't want one. She was just happy to be, as you say, who she was.
Yeah. Well, Napoleon still granted her an annual stipend of 500,000 francs, and Madame Marie, as she's now known, famously saved the money, saying about the opulence that Napoleon and his siblings lived in, so long as it lasts. Why does she remain distant from the imperial court? Is it Josephine? Is it she didn't want to be around all that opulence? Why didn't she want to be around all that?
Well, that's one of those questions that's hard to answer. We can only speculate, right? And I think, one, she didn't want to be around Josephine. She didn't want to be around a court dominated by Josephine. Now, Napoleon's sisters will. And they'll fight with Josephine and try to become the dominant influence at French court. But, as long as Josephine's around, she's kind of snapping the whip, because she's the master of Paris salon society. But Letizia goes, I'm not even going to try. And so she goes back to her homeland, Italy, and kind of maintains her distance. Yeah.
Well, in 1814, she accompanies Napoleon to his exile in Elba, and she later encourages him to return to France to reclaim his throne. Do you think she was his biggest supporter?
No, but I think she's kind of his second biggest supporter. I think Napoleon's biggest supporter is Maria Wałęsa, his Polish mistress. When all the chips are down, Napoleon's biggest supporters are Joseph and Maria. Even though Joseph mishandles the ball in 1814 and again sort of in 1815, he still loves his brother and supports him. Joseph has got to be one of the best older brothers of all time. Although Lucien, I think, spoke truth to Napoleon, and he loved Napoleon too, but he wasn't willing to compromise his values. But Letizia does support him. She does see the mess that France is in. She sees it as low hanging fruit. She thinks, well, he's learned his lesson. She just doesn't understand the animosity the rest of Europe has towards her genius, brilliant son, and that they just don't trust him.
Well, it's interesting. Like, all children think they're special in their mom's eyes. And in Napoleon's case, he was, but then she had these other seven siblings who she loved. But, like famously, after Napoleon's downfall in 1815, Letizia retires to Rome, and she never speaks to Caroline Bonaparte ever again for betraying her brother Napoleon, right?
Oh, right, right. Yeah, no, Carolyn is the Fredo of the family. She's dead to Letizia
Right.
after she does that. Yeah.
Yeah, because her and Murat, joined the Allies and they go against the.
Right. And then Murat, could never make up his mind completely, and then he switches sides again, and that tragedy is just incredible, right? So yeah, Letizia retires to Rome. She's protected by the Pope. she had been she'd always been very kind and generous to the Pope, and he remembered that. And Pius said, "Hey, Letizia is a good Catholic girl. You know, one of the reasons the Concordat happens is Letizia's influence on her son,
Mm.
and so she's under my protection." And she goes back to her homeland, Italy. We gotta keep remembering the Bonapartes are as much Italian as they are French, and Napoleon's sister is totally Italian. Elisa is Italian, and that's where her lands are, and where she spends the bulk of her life is in. So it's no accident that that they all end up back either in Italy or in America.
Yeah.
It's fascinating what happens to the Bonapartes.
Well, Letizia dies in 1836 at the old age of 85. The legacy of Letizia, Napoleon once said, quote, "The future destiny of the child is always the work of the mother," end quote. So I guess it's a two-part question. What is Letizia's legacy and Carlo's legacy?
So I'm going to use some classical allusions here. Carlos is pretty easy. He's the father. He's the man married to the woman, right? So there's all these great leaders in history. We know about their mothers.
Hmm.
Okay, we know about Caesar's mother. She's dynamic. She's a pusher, a social climber. We know about Churchill's mother, Jenny Randolph. She's a climber. She's a pusher. We know about Cornelia, mother of the Gracchi. She's a pusher. We don't know about the fathers. So Carlo's legacy is sort of hidden, from history. There should be more there. But again, Carlo's biggest legacy to the Bonapartes is he marries well.
Well, and give him credit for dropping Napoleon off at Brienne at age 10.
Yeah, the decision to take advantage of what the French court and the French king are offering. When you think about the generosity of Louis XV and the Duc de Choiseul and Marbeuf towards the Corsicans, you have to go, the French behaved well in
Mhm.
that circumstance. They could have been much, much worse than they were.
Right.
But Letizia's legacy is she's the mother of the Gracchi, but it's the Gracchi on steroids,
Mm.
and I mean, all of Napoleon's, brothers become kings, all right? And Letizia is the mother of kings and an emperor. So, when we think about her legacy, her legacy is absolutely this family who will continue to dominate Europe long after Napoleon's dead, with her grandnephew Louis Napoleon III, and
Yeah.
then even in the United States with the Secretary of the Navy
That's right.
Charles Bonaparte.
Yep.
So I mean, she's
But
got an incredible legacy.
give her full credit though. She didn't let the opulence and the money go to her head like some of her children. She kind of stayed, austere and frugal throughout.
Yeah, and she's one of these people, she's constrained by the mores of society on what she can do, how much power she could wield. Certainly, Carolyn didn't want to be constrained by those mores. Pauline just wanted to be a pretty face on the arm of a handsome man,
Mm.
but not Carolyn. But Letizia shows you what could be accomplished back then by a woman who had a good head on her shoulders and a will of iron. And we talk about the Iron Marshal Davout. Letizia is the Iron Mother.
That's a good ending right there. I love that. Well, thank you for that, John. Once again, John has a really interesting book called The Bonapartes of Corsica that hopefully is coming out soon one day.
If somebody wants to share it, then I'm willing to share it. I shared it with a couple people already. My brother, I like the Bonapartes. I've been sharing my stuff with my family.
Yeah, you can also find John on Twitter. What's the tag again?
It's JCune50
That's right.
at JCune50. I'm also on Blue Sky at JCune50. So
Okay.
you can find me at either Blue Sky or Twitter.
Okay. Yeah. So please give John a follow there. And yeah, as always, we thank you for coming on. Thanks, John.
Great, John. Thanks for having me on.